These are all examples of through-hole components. You can see that all of these components have legs on them. That's because the legs are designed to go through a hole on a PCB and solder onto it. Here we've got our example board, and here I've got some header. So I'm going to put the header through the holes and solder on this side of the board. I've put down a little bit of tape here because I'm getting a fair bit of reflection in the camera. Here we've got 3 pins and I'm going to solder them. Our method is the same. Clean the solder tip. Second, put a little bit of solder on the solder tip so that we can see where the hot spot is. Then put the solder tip on both the pad and the through-hole component. You need to heat up both surfaces at the same time. Wait a moment and then put a little bit of solder down. Wait a moment longer, take the solder tip off. I hope you can see it okay, but the shape of that solder is pretty good. Here we've got our PCB, the leg of our component, and our soldering pad. In a perfect world, we want the shape of our solder to look like this. Now there's a few tricks. If you get a solder joint that looks something like this, probably what's happened is that you haven't heated up the leg of your component. So if you just heat up the leg again, you'll get the solder flowing and sticking to the leg of your component. The other thing that can happen is if you're looking at the top of the solder joint, if you get solder that only covers a portion of the pad, you need to get solder all the way around the solder pad, including this area too. If this is happening to you, then maybe you've heated up this area enough but not this area enough. So start again by putting heat here and try and let the solder flow back through this area before you add more. You can see here that the header isn't quite at right angles to the board. So this is why I've only soldered 1 pin. While you've just got 1 pin soldered, I could molten that down again and straighten the pin and make it right. And that's looking pretty straight now. I've added the solder to the tip and I'm going to touch the tip onto the leg and the component, wait a little bit of time and take the solder off. I'll do it again. Clean the tip, add a little bit of solder to the tip so I can see the hot part of the tip, add the tip to the leg and the soldering pad, wait a moment, add a little bit of solder to the leg and the soldering pad, wait a moment more, take the soldering tip off, and enjoy my handiwork. Oh my, look at that. I seem to have melted my plastic. I'm just going to clean the molten plastic off my soldering tip. When you're soldering components, you need to let the component rise off the board a little bit. If the component sits flush with the board, you don't give the component room to dissipate heat or change shape if it needs to, or expand. In the case of this LED, there's some marks on the LED that show where the recommended height of the LED should be. And if you turn it upside down, sometimes the component will want to fall out. To stop this happening, you can bend the legs of the component a little just to hold it in place. Just the same as the header, I'm going to solder down 1 leg, and that LED is way in the wrong position. So I'm going to heat that leg again, get it into the right position. That's looking pretty good. Now I'm going to solder the other leg and then fix up my original solder joint, which is looking pretty average. The very last thing I'm going to do now is trim the leg of my component. Of course, I don't need to trim the leg of these components because they're already quite short. If I solder down this capacitor, it's really important to leave that space just like I did with the LED. Capacitors, if something goes wrong, need to vent top and bottom. The other thing with capacitors is that heat can damage the capacitor. So now I'm going to solder in that capacitor. Here we go. Come on, get on in there. Check underneath. That's looking pretty good still. So I'm going to leave it just like that. Solder the other leg. Then back to the first one. Maybe a little bit more solder. It's quite possible to add too much solder. If you keep adding solder, you get a bloated, fat-looking solder joint like this. They're horrible looking joints.